IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
All right, here we are again with yet another episode on All Things Policy. And today I have with me Josiah. And the kind of things we're going to talk about is a broad spectrum of what education can look like, a journey that was very different for me versus Josiah, who's been raised in Australia. So we thought it's a nice conversation to dwell into how these experiences can also shape the kind of career options we take up and what the education ecosystem itself can offer people while we are navigating through it, right? It could be the primary education, it could also be the things that we pick up much later because we want to be more job relevant kind of thing. So we'll touch upon the framework of Samaj Sarkar Bazaar. And we'll not specifically go into each of these, but broadly we will capture how the policy implications could look like as well. So welcome, Josiah.
Thank you.
Okay. So in India, for the longest, we have seen that education, although is accessible to a lot of people today, it's still a privilege as well, right? And for us, we began mostly with how the colonial impression was, okay, English. We said, okay, when you're choosing a school, probably if I look at my own, education phase, it was primarily that you look at a school which probably is English medium. Right. So that was how choices were made. And today we have a lot of rural schools and Anganwadis which cater to that segment of people who don't have the privilege of accessing education easily. But the government schools do struggle with having, say, technology in place or even having teachers who could come regularly and teach. So just wanted to have a fair idea of how this works in Australia.
Sure. So in Australia, we also have a public-private divide. So we have a state school system that is primarily administered by state governments as well. So it's not something that's managed federally. And so different states will take different approaches, and territories as well. So we have a distinction between states and territories like India does. But those governments will take different approaches and implement different policies. But we do have a national curriculum that's set by the federal government. So that basically requires certain subjects or certain topics to a certain standard to be taught across all schools in Australia. The state schools are government funded, they're free to attend, so they're accessible for everyone. And they also they serve a particular area. So generally, I think it's normally done on a postcode basis or a PIN code or zip code basis. So that means that to attend that school, you have to be a resident of the area. That there are some exceptions to that rule, or you can apply for exceptions to that rule, as far as I know. But I wouldn't know because I went to a private school, which is the other half. Now, in Australia, there are many different private schools. We have schools that are part of or that are funded by or run by church organizations, so Catholic schools, Anglican schools. We also have independent private schools, so like grammar schools or what are called independent private schools. So generally, they charge higher fees. They have like very strong donation cultures as well from their alumni or their old boys or old girls or whatever the term may be. And so I went to an independent private school for high schooling. And that's also probably something that's different, is that schools here are generally K to 12, whereas in Australia, there's generally the distinction is between primary school and high school, or elementary school, as they call it in America. So grades prep or preschool through to grade 6, which is 11 years old. is primary school, and then grade 7 or 12 years old through to grade 12, which is 18, is high school. And a lot of people will generally send their children to a local primary school so that they can be nearby because they're younger, they're in a familiar environment. Maybe they're going to school with, the neighbors' children and their friends that they already have in that community. Whereas the high school decision often is more about where do you want to go, what kind of what kind of career are you interested in, what kind of opportunities you want. If a child is good at a particular sport or another activity, that also factors into the equation. So I went to a local Catholic primary school with 400 students, whereas from graduating there, I then went to an independent all-boys private school that had about 1,500 boys across all the grades, and also had a large boarding population. So we had a lot of students living on campus from rural areas or even some from other countries who had decided to come to that school. And so it was a very different environment. And then there's you can grade, there's sort of grades to the different private schools, but it depends a lot on the individual institution. I wouldn't be able to say that all Catholic schools are of a certain standard, or all independent private schools are of a certain standard, or all sort of non-denominational Christian schools in Australia are of a certain standard. And it's the same with the government schools as well. It really depends on the area. It depends on how much the community around it is invested in the school. And it depends on how much both the state government, the federal government, private donors are all invested in the one school. Right. So a lot of factors can change the quality of education.
Interesting. So we also have different boards here, like the CBSE, ICSE, state boards. But I think a lot of parents also choose, like you said, with distance, because when children are younger, even a longer commute might mean a lot of fatigue and stuff like that. But the proximity is just one aspect. Those schools give it a little bit of preference. You will see in India a lot of, especially urban population, going for schools which are at least an hour and a half away at times. So that means a lot of traffic to, also bear with. Interesting. So coming to what the education outcomes could look like. So is there a prescribed methodology that's used to approach the curriculum, the pedagogy, or even looking at learning outcomes? What goes into the programming of it?
Sure. So because I haven't been in teaching myself that much, I don't know the details of it, but from the insight that I have had, like I said, there's a national curriculum. So that sets a minimum standard. We do have as well standardized testing for most school students in Australia in grades 3, 5, 7, and 9. It's called NAPLAN.
Okay.
And so that provides some indication for an individual student and also for schools as to where they rank academically on a national scale, although there have been criticisms of that standardized testing system and how it doesn't cater to some students. For approaches to pedagogy and the content of the curriculum, it really comes down to either the leading organization for a group of schools. So, for example, for Catholic schools, the organization, which is a subsidiary of the Catholic Church of Australia, is Catholic Education. And so they will set the curriculum, and it'll be broadly the same across all Catholic schools. And the same is true for Lutheran schools, for Anglican schools. So, for example, in Lutheran schools, they, at least in the state where I'm from, Queensland, nearly all of them are required at some point in their schooling to spend 4 weeks camping, out in the wilderness without their phones, and it provides them some kind of opportunity for reflection and to sort of interact with their classmates in a different environment, away from all of the comforts of sort of modern life. And so there'll be similar programs like that across, and then across the schools in that specific denomination or group. And then the same is true for government schools. So the state government will set like certain standards or set the curriculum. And then there will be some independent private schools like the one that I went to that go really above and beyond. And those schools also tend to be the ones that I think give the teachers a lot more autonomy in setting the curriculum themselves. So I know that my teachers, when I was in high school, had a lot of freedom to decide what they taught in their class and to decide what they thought was important. And as long as they met the minimum requirements that the school set and they met the minimum national requirements, which were inherently accounted for in the school's requirements. So as long as they met like certain criteria, they were free to teach what they wanted. And so I think that, that comes with some benefits, but then it comes with drawbacks for those that go to schools where they're simply sort of being taught the bare minimum, and those students that are more curious have to go and then pursue that outside of the classroom.
Okay. So how do they actually go about assessing, like while you were part of the system itself? Is it assessment via MCQs or looking at some fun ways to, figure out where the strengths of the individual lie? How do they go about doing it?
I think that there has been more of an effort recently. I even saw in the last couple of years of my schooling a diversification of assessment types. Originally, it was sort of tests or quizzes and then essays, sort of like the fairly traditional two options. There was a marked shift during my high school years towards more presentations. So more like verbal skill, being able to explain yourself verbally. I know that, for example, in science classes, students were required to perform the experiment and then they were required to write a report about it. So it had a practical and a theoretical element. And now I think that that's even more diverse. So, for example, I think that students now who maybe take, I'm trying to think of a good example. If they take a maths class in their final year, which they're required to take some kind of maths class, they might have to go out into the world and find a practical example of trigonometry at work, right? So like they might stand on the ground and look at a building and be able to, based on calculating the distance from the base of the building, they can calculate the distance from like their eyes to the point of the building or something like that. So that was one exercise, for example, that we did in one of my final years of mathematics. So, but primarily I think that you could kind of trifurcate the assessment types into presentation or oral styles of presenting, which try to build those skills, communicating via speech, communicating via like in a literary manner. So with writing, whether that's in English, sometimes it would be fiction work, but then apart from that, it would be essays and reports and the like. And then also being tested under pressure when it comes to your final years. So when it comes to like the grade 11 and 12, and that's when your marks are counted towards your tertiary admission rank. So the score that you will receive for university, that is, I would say, predominantly test-based. 50% of the assessment during that period is actually set externally. So up until that point, all of the assessment in Australian schools would have been written by the teacher or teachers in the school. It would have been completely internally set, and they set the standards, right? Then in grade 11 and 12, the students will have 50% of their assessment set and like marked internally.
Okay.
And then 50% will be external exams. So it will be set by an independent authority. They decide the questions and the students have the opportunity to practice. But that is not only the main hurdle, because if you happen to be in a school with maybe less resources, or maybe the teachers aren't as committed to making sure that you know the curriculum or that your learning is up to standard, then when you reach that external sort of benchmarking period towards the end of your studies, you will find out that you are like perhaps not as highly ranked compared to the people studying that subject in the rest of Australia. So, for example, up until the end of 10th grade, you might have been receiving A's in like a business subject. And then when in grade 11 and 12, you sit an independently written and examined economics exam or business exam, you find out that on a national scale, you really are only sitting on a B minus in like that knowledge and in your ability to apply that knowledge. So sometimes it's a bit of a harsh reality check as well. But that is like sort of a broad overview about how things work. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Let's also switch gears and move towards the economics of it, right? So being in good schools, or rather, I would say schools which have the infrastructure and all sorts of stuff in it, have also they come with a cost here. I mean, which is quite steep, even for a toddler to get into a play school to even an engineering graduate school is means shelling out a lot of money. So I wanted to understand from you, how is it structured in Australia? Like if people are unable to access, then what are their options and how do they go about it?
Sure. So the upper end of schooling, like the very elite private schools, would be like $30,000 per year, or even more in larger cities. And then it scales all the way down. The smaller and perhaps less prestigious private schools will be about $4,000 per year. But for those who don't have the financial means to send their children to private school, then public school is normally their primary option or their main option. Then to a certain extent, I think it's luck of the draw, because it depends on where you live. So as I said before, those schools' intakes, some of them exclusively will only take children from the surrounding area, or some of them will preference children from the surrounding area. And for example, in the city that I grew up in, there was 2 high schools not very far apart, but the difference in them was very distinct. So there was one called Centenary Heights State High School, and they even down to their uniforms, they had blazer attire. They were, I would say that getting an education at that state school, which is free, would have been much higher than St. Joseph's, which was a Catholic education private school, maybe 5 minutes drive, 10 minutes drive away, which cost, well, I mean, it's you're multiplying by 0. So it costs it costs maybe a couple of $1,000s per year compared to 0 cost or very minimal cost at the state high school. But that school was known to have behavioral problems with its students, attendance problems. It was generally, if you got expelled from a nicer private school in my city, that was generally where you ended up. And so to a certain extent, it matters where you live. And I think as well for the state schools, what becomes important is how much the local member of parliament advocates for them to get extra funding, how much they receive in goodwill donations from the community. And then also organizations, most schools will have a PNF, or Parents and Friends Association, or PNC, Parents and Colleagues Association. And so I think that in some schools, even the government schools, those PNF associations are very active. They're very invested in their children's education, and they're very determined to make even a government school that they don't pay for, that they really have no financial investment in. They're determined to make sure that it is providing those children with opportunity. And so that really probably comes down to what kind of socioeconomic area the school is in, because those parents obviously have more time on their hands, right? To volunteer to improve the school and put in all these extra sort of activities or initiatives, and they have money as well, it's like disposable income to donate to the school. So that's really, I think, often the deciding factor. And I'm sure that there are families out there who, when their children are coming to school age, they endeavor to perhaps even move suburbs to make sure that they're near a better school or a better government school, as opposed to sending them to, as opposed to spending money to send them to one of the same or lower standard. There really is like a very broad mix, and it depends on the area and it depends on the people around you.
Interesting. So if we kind of move to the next phase, right, which is more your professional courses, and at least the approach that we take here in India is, of course, is it going to fetch you a job, and how much of pay you would get at the start? Plus, also for a lot of people, education loans are not easily accessible. So even the interest rates are not feasible. So a lot of times the struggle is to also pay that off. So it means that you've got to get to a job which will allow you to do that, and some savings. So how do people in Australia approach it? Is it very driven with getting job and getting placements being the agenda, or looking at the overall interests and the side gigs, and how do they nurture all of this?
I think that primarily it's interest based. I know plenty of people who studied something at university or at a tertiary institution, which is completely unrelated to not just the job that they are in now, but the job that they received directly after university. Someone I know did a law degree and went into marketing. So, but they were interested in law. And I think that part of the reason for that is that students make this decision when they're 18. And by the time that they finish a standard 3-year bachelor's, they're 21 and they might have completely changed as a person. And they've finished their maturing, and they don't have the peer pressure of their high school friends telling them what they should study. And perhaps also for some of them, they no longer have the influence of their parents around, and they've actually determined what they really want. And I think that there is definitely considerations of will it help me get a job? That's primarily true for professions. If a high school graduate wants to go into a profession that has a body or a chartered body, right? Some kind of certification that's required. So that's your doctors, lawyers, engineers, accountants, stockbrokers. So if someone wants to be a chartered financial accountant, if someone wants to be a chartered engineer, wants to be admitted as a solicitor, then obviously they need to receive some kind of standardized education at a good institution. Apart from that, I think that there's almost infinite ways of getting to the same place. There's people I know who are high school graduates who started at university, decided that it wasn't for them, and entered the job market and are now working alongside people who have just finished studying. And arguably the person who has had 3 years of experience in the job market, as opposed to 3 years of looking through books, is more valuable to that company, right? So I think it really depends. The big trend that we're seeing now is what's called micro-credentialing. So that's like graduate certificates. So that's really common, is that if someone, for example, does a law degree, but they work in marketing, they might do a graduate certificate, which they can do while they're working in their spare time, which helps them run Google ads or something like that. And it's basically the equivalent of one university subject. And they just stack up all of these little credentials in their new job, as opposed to switching and studying something else.
Interesting. So how do people actually, go about doing their side gigs? Is it embedded within the system, or is it something like, say, I know sports is big in Australia, or a lot of people might be interested in pursuing different languages, or I don't know if you using a lot of edtech kind of things like Coursera and other tools that are there in the MOOC format, right? So do these credits count, and do people actually go about finishing it, and how do you approach that?
Sure. So I'll speak quickly about high school and then what it's like in university. Generally, with sport and extracurricular activities, the emphasis throughout education in Australia is a well-rounded individual. So there are opportunities to do those kind of extracurriculars in both high schools and universities, even in government schools, even in public universities. There will be sort of a club for every sport. There will be a chess club, a Dungeons and Dragons club, which is like a board game. So although people who play Dungeons and Dragons won't like I called it a board game. But there is, sort of like plenty of opportunities. And then there are also options for maybe if it isn't available, or maybe if students want to forge their own path, they will do something outside of that. So very niche interests, like, for example, equestrian. So like competition with horses is not something that educational institutions can normally support because you need stables and horses and fields. So students will pursue that outside of school. When it comes to things like EdTech, they're very common. I don't know whether they have received the recognition that they should. I think that like we certainly have them in high school. Like students will use Khan Academy to help them during their classes if there's something that doesn't make sense when they're doing their homework because their teacher's not contactable at 8:00 at night. They will go on Khan Academy and it will explain it. There are also opportunities like LinkedIn Learning, Coursera during university. So sometimes I know of students who they might be studying law, and this goes to the micro-credentialing that I was talking about, is that they might be studying law, but they decide that it would be useful to know how to write in JavaScript or code in JavaScript. And so they take a course online to specifically learn that skill. But apart from that, that's probably a select few who decide that they need to have that skill for where they want to go. And they're the ones that have sort of planned their career trajectory and they are targeting specific skills. The broader use of them, it probably isn't common. So most people stick to their course content. But within courses, within even high school, and then within university courses, there's elective choices. So in high school, for example, you could choose between learning French or Japanese. You could learn between doing accounting or economics, or you could do both if you wanted to. We had modern and ancient history. So ancient history is everything up to the French Revolution, and then everything after the French Revolution was modern history. And so there were all of these options that you could take. You could do music, or you could do drama. You could do design technology, which involves 3D printing and things like that. So there are all these options. And I think really what it comes down to in the Australian system is providing as many options and then helping the student make an informed choice. But really it comes down to student choice. Like it's a very individualistic approach.
Okay. And do you also have, say, banking firms and other corporates coming for placements and students having options to choose between different sort of industries they want to belong to? So is that something that is set as an expectation that an academic institution will provide for, or is it something that an individual will go and figure out?
No, so primarily high schools are expected to provide some kind of opportunity or options for students to pursue further education. That could be to a trade school, that could be to a university. For universities, there is absolutely an onus on them to provide some kind of assistance with the job search. Most will provide like a career service or a careers center where you can make appointments with a counselor, and they will talk to you about your interests. They will talk about what you're studying, what specifically in the course that you've studied you've been most interested in, so they can help you to find your niche. And then also with your grades and with the other activities that you've done, where might be reasonable or where you might be likely to receive a job. And then we have things like those same career centers on university campuses will host like job fairs where employers will come and set up a table and you'll be able to talk to them and they'll give you a leaflet. And then if you network with the recruiters that are there, then you're more likely, and then you put their name down when you apply, you're more likely to get a job. So there is a whole system there. And then there's just probably a small disparity between universities or between high schools as to the quality of that help, or as to how tailored that help is to the individual student based on the quality of the education that you're paying for or not paying for.
Interesting. Great. So thanks, Josiah. I think you took us nicely from the start to what could look like a mature adult who's reached a phase of deciding what careers to choose. And Josiah is here in India with us at Takshashila Institution for a short stint, more like an internship. And he's explored this as part of his fellowship, and he's always looked outside of Australia for his other projects. And I think that's a nice way to also understand how different geographies approach things and how they look at policies or anything in the geopolitics environment as well. So thanks, Josiah. I think this also gives us nice insights about how education globally has similarities, but it also has these little things that are different. And with our new education policy, we're looking at tweaking how we are not boxed into the science and the humanities kind of a distinction, but look at a more harmonious way of, allowing students to opt in for pure sciences plus something in the other side as well. So I think we're slowly evolving and hoping that even the education loan system, the financial access, and just the quality of education is something that we aspire to see will grow and change, and will have more flexibility as well. So wonderful having this conversation with you, Josiah. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.